we get started, introduce our panel. I'll start with ladies first. So Cindy Hausen is Chief Data Strategy Officer at ThoughtSpot. I've known her forever. Obviously, Cindy, besides being Chief Data Strategy Officer at ThoughtSpot, was previously an industry analyst at both Gartner and also as an independent industry analyst like myself at BI Scorecard. So, real pleasure to have you come all the way from the East Coast of the US. Thank you, Cindy, for coming.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me in.
Okay, for letting you in. Let me introduce Ben properly this time. After screwing up this morning, I apologize for that. So Ben Stopford is technical lead at the CTO office in Confluent. He reports to the CEO of Confluent, Jay Krebs, who has keynoted this conference himself. A couple of years back, he's written a book on designing event-driven systems, and he's worked as an engineer on Kafka. He's formerly a director and distinguished engineer at RBS, and was a consultant at ThoughtWorks and technical lead at Barclays Capital. So, welcome, Ben. Thank you very much. Beyond Cindy is Girish Pancha, who again I've known forever, who is CEO of StreamSets, who are on the floor here at the show. Girish co-founded StreamSets a number of years ago and has built a product in the data engineering space, which takes you all the way out to the edge. Prior to StreamSets, he was Chief Product Officer, Executive Vice President, and General Manager at Informatica for a number of years. And prior to that, in charge of BI development at Oracle. So welcome, Girish.
Thank you.
Beyond Girish, we have Rishi Diwan. Oh, by the way, Girish, I think, deserves a round of applause all the way from the west coast of the US. Well done, Girish.
There's more of us here.
And so he's probably on the wrong time zone, by the way. Similarly, so is Rishi, who's also from California. And Rishi is Chief Product Officer at Exasol, which is an in-memory massive parallel database vendor, headquartered in Germany. And in Rishi's case, he has, I think not too long, I think in the pandemic, you actually joined Exasol. But prior to that, he was in charge of product management at Salesforce. He was also Global Vice President and Head of Product Management at SAP and Director of Strategy at Oracle in previous years. So welcome, Rishi. And finally, last but not least, we have Chris D'Agostino, who is Field Chief Technology Officer at Databricks. And again, I think, are you from the West Coast too?
San Francisco as well. That's awesome. He's got to have a round of applause.
And so that's three of our panel on the wrong time zone, which is good for me. And of course, Chris, previously to that, was also Vice President of Engineering and Head of Digital Transformation at Capital One. So, welcome, Chris.
Thanks.
Yeah. So let's get started and look at the kind of key areas that I want to get through in the debate. So prior to this, obviously, is the first show after the pandemic. We've been through 18 months of, let's say, unplanned territory. Mm-hmm. And I think the world has changed quite a lot. And I think priorities have changed quite a lot. With many businesses being in trouble, having to go online to survive, and a lot of customer interaction now happening online. So my first question is, having been through the pandemic, what would you say, has changed in your customers, in terms of business priorities with respect to data and analytics? I mean, are you seeing that it's cost focused now? Is it risk reduction? Is it customer focused? How do you see that? Anybody want to start the ball rolling?
Sure.
Rishi, go ahead.
I'll kick it off. It's a little, I was asked to project my voice because it's going to be loud in here. The biggest change we see, I think we've all seen this, is data and analytics as a driver of responsiveness, whether that's reactive or proactive. So adapting very quickly to changes in the business. Our customer, Piedmont Healthcare, for example, had to design 12 new dashboards to deal with pandemic-related processes, and they did that in 2 months because they were ready with an infrastructure that was ready to be responsive and reactive. And on the proactive side, coming up with completely new business models, finding innovation, finding new ways to drive innovation, analytics becomes key as well. So I think just having that foundation, so Revolut is a customer of ours that had phenomenal growth during the pandemic. So both proactive and reactive responsiveness in the infrastructure becomes paramount. I think cost is secondary to that right now, but of course it always becomes a factor.
Okay.
Yeah,
Chris, please.
I guess I would add that, obviously most businesses have pivoted and they've moved to more of an online channel in terms of collecting information about customers and clickstream events and things like that. One of the big things that we've seen, and I think this was absolutely true with like Zoom and virtual meetings, was just the need to collaborate among data teams and finding ways to do that given remote work and the move now towards permanent remote work for some companies and hybrid models. So the idea that data is more of a team sport and you're trying to get the data engineers, the data science community, the data analysts, the business analysts all together working against ideally a single view of the data, but do it in a collaborative way that's enabled through remote work.
But have you found like a greater urgency to get data because of the fact that everybody's moved online, for example, or what's the situation?
Yeah, I mean, so if there's a silver lining, now is the moment for data and analytics. Both Mike and I started in this space, must have been when we were in kindergarten, but 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, and it was a specialist task, a backroom task. One survey found that 69% of organizations were forced and have the opportunity to accelerate their digital transformation plans and the move to cloud and the move for faster data. I think of this as kind of the architecture and the plumbing, but the reason is really as you go to digital, you don't know who your customers are unless you're leveraging that data. And so the pandemic really was a forcing function to reprioritize customer first. It's not just cost cutting. The other thing I'm really happy about is people analytics. We often say people are our number one asset, and yet that is the lowest prioritized use case until now. When we look at who's vaccinated, the great attrition or the great resignation, as some are calling it. So I think it's also been a reprioritization.
Now, I'd add not so much about what the business is using the software for, but the behavior, I think, also changed to focus a lot more on success. In the past, I think people would buy up front, we'd land larger deals. What we found was that the follow-on business with our customers accelerated. So whether or not the land was kind of smaller or not, the expectation was much more that we're only going to pay if we succeed. And I think that was a mind shift. It wasn't so much about helping the business with saving costs. It was really about kind of guaranteeing success.
Certainly what I saw amongst my customers, well, amongst my clients, was that they really started to switch attention on their customers, more than anything else, because of the fact that they were forced online, and loyalty's pretty cheap online because you can find out alternatives pretty quickly, and as a result of that, it changed a lot of the priorities amongst the analytical projects that they had to really go after customer, and but that took on all kinds of new data as a result of it. They went for things like customer opinion. There was all the online behavior because they didn't have that or they weren't looking at that in data warehouses. So all that clickstream data, which is pretty enormous in volume, coming in. I wanted to be able to respond to that pretty rapidly as it came in. In addition to that, there was relationships, trying to do graph analytics and things like that to discover any new relationships. So there was like a whole flurry of activity around customers. But that also opened up problems, and I'm kind of curious what you've seen again in your customers, because it caused new kinds of data to come in. They were in different analytical systems, but in order to get a complete picture of the customer, they need to integrate that data, whether some of that data was sitting in Hadoop, or some of the data was coming in on Kafka, or some of the data was sitting in data warehouses and whatnot. And that caused a lot of issues, because customer wasn't interacting with a person, they were interacting with apps. And so the customer intelligence had to go into the app in order to personalize an experience. So not only did they have to collect the data, then they had to integrate it, but then they had to integrate it with the app that the customer was using. So this kind of really focused the attention. But given that, I mean, it caused all kinds of architectural issues, because different kinds of data ended up with different silos, and they struggled with that. I mean, I just kind of wondered, what you've seen, I mean, as a solution to that. I mean, do you just see that people stitch together bits of data to come up with that, or have you seen other more innovative solutions around that?
Well, go ahead.
Maybe I'll say this one, but so the one area that we definitely see the most change, I say by far, is kind of retail. All the retail customers there's just kind of been a boom, certainly for our business in that area. Primarily because, as you said, actually, it's kind of that customer focus, but it's also the fact that they're having to compete. A lot of retail businesses had to really sort of double down on their digital transformation, and that means being able to connect together all of the information across often their retail stores. So a lot of these kind of retail digital hybrid companies want to actually make use of the fact that they've got points of presence that are spread around the country. I mean Walmart's a good example of this in the States. I think they have like some crazy stat like they have a store within 10 miles of 90% of the population of the US, and be it just doing something like managing inventory across, they've got like 10,000 stores or something. It's a very complicated problem. So I think the pattern that we sort of see is people wanting to use Confluent to connect these various different data sets and make sure that they've got like real-time data available so they can solve problems like particularly around inventory and unifying the customer experience, so that they get to see a single pane of glass which sits over what is otherwise a pretty complicated architecture.
Right. Okay, so let me switch attention to a problem that's really driving major issues with a lot of my clients right now. I think it's becoming clear, in a lot of my clients at least, is that there's so many use cases for analytics that companies are struggling with data architecture. So, because of the fact that I got traditional data warehousing, and I've got an architecture for that, and I've got people trying to join data warehouses to Hadoop with a logical data warehouse, and there's an architecture for that. And then we have streaming analytics, and there's an architecture for that, even a reference architecture for that with Kappa architecture. We've got data science with all kinds of workloads, building models. We've also got graph analytics going on with a graph database and an architecture for that. We hear talk about data lakes, lake houses, and now we've got data mesh. And quite frankly, every one of my clients is calling me up and confused like crazy and going, what do we do with all of this? I mean, are these silos? Because that's what's happened in a lot of my customers. And it seems that they're competing, all of these architectures. And it also seems that it's, forcing issues like data integration, so many ways to integrate data in each of these silos. And so it's also specialist technologies influencing the whole thing. We've got, as streaming, as I said, we've even got time series databases now. We've got Hadoop systems, we've got graph database, we've got in-memory database. So, I mean, do you think architecture, I mean, I'm an analyst, so I'm only seeing what I'm seeing, but amongst your customers, is this coming up?
Yeah, I'm going to take a bit of a provocative view here, because I think we use the word architecture for a lot of scopes, so to speak, right? You've got enterprise architecture, you have data architecture, you obviously have architecture for applications, you can have architectures for use cases. I personally think that the term architecture, if you think about it in the real world, you talk about using architecture to build a building. So you've got a building, it may have multiple rooms, you may have an overall architecture, and then you may have to make the right decisions for each of the rooms. I think for the enterprise, we got to start thinking about it more like a city rather than just the building, right? Because you've got so many different buildings in the town, and the skill set or the discipline for that in the real world is urban planning. It's not architecture. I was in some of the talks even today, and for a platform person, architecture means something. For an apps person, architecture means something. Everybody's going to say something. So when I think about data architecture, I always go one level further down and say, okay, what is the scope that you're talking about? Are you talking about an enterprise-wide solution or a single-purpose solution? Because that's going to have different kind of answers. And then you got to make up your mind. So of course, I started the company, to reinvent data integration, so we can talk about that if there's enough time. But we saw so much change all the time in the evolution of the platforms, and it's very much the case. When we take a snapshot, and we've got a couple of very esteemed platform companies here, Confluent and Databricks, with huge amount of momentum. I've seen that multiple times in the past, and somehow, even with that, there's always a new technology, a new database, a new approach to doing things. So I think, ultimately we've got to be ready to be agile for change rather than trying to figure out what that perfect architecture is.
Yeah.
I'd amplify that. I'd amplify that because I don't use a city analogy, but each of our customers looks completely different from the other customer. There is no non-zero starting point to design a new architecture, right? So you're walking into a complex architecture based on the organic use cases that the customer built. So when we look at our customer, we view them as the new platform. So for my product team, I have 5 design principles that I talk about, and they, A, E, I, O, U is easy to remember. As much as we can, focus on automation. As much as we can, design for extensibility. As much as we can, interoperate with existing technologies instead of trying to give them a new architecture to work with. Focus on the operational reliability and cost. And lastly, go for use cases that matter. So be user-centered and use case-centered. So with those 5 design principles, I think all vendors should really adopt those. And I do agree with you. I think complexity is increasing in the aggregate, but at the individual stack level, it's going down. So I think we have to tell our customers to kind of not be too stressed out about that. And I think the use case that you talked about before.
Do you think the bosses care? Do you think the C-suite cares?
No.
If it doesn't work.
Oh,
Yeah, oh yeah, and if it's going to cost millions of dollars and deliver nothing in a year. So what bosses care about are the quick wins. I think of the data mesh, the lake house, the data warehouse. That's just all the how of how we get to the data. And I think, Arish, you mentioned something that's really important, the skills. What are the skills? If some of your data architects started in the 90s and they're only thinking the data warehouse is the gold standard and they haven't evolved past that, one of my CDOs said, it's really easy to change the technology, 20-year-old technology. It's harder to change the 20-year-old mindsets. Yeah. The other thing we have to consider is the cost. So it's the right cost for that use case, but have quick wins, show deliverable progress.
So Mike,
I have so just going back to your original point, these various different trends, the thing I like about them isn't actually so much the technology. I like the fact that it makes us talk about it, because in the mid-2000s, I would go to a conference and there'd be a whole bunch of debate in the software engineering world around different forms of agile practices, different ways of building systems. Try and get someone to talk about data architecture in the mid-2000s. You know, there'd be like 20 people. You were doing it.
I was doing it, yeah.
There was like 20 people turn up. And no one would talk about it. And the great thing about these trends is it's not actually so much the details of whether data mesh is better than a data lakehouse. It's the fact that actually we're trying this stuff out and we're working out whether or not it's good. And there's actually people interested in it. That's the best bit. People are actually having opinions. And there is debate.
I run courses on this stuff and it's packed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's packed.
The best form of, there's a great quote, and I can't remember who it's by, but there's a great quote that the best form of learning is argument or debate. And that's actually what's happening in the community right now, is there's a lot of debate around what are these different these different approaches are. And the reason I made the correlation back to the software engineering world is software engineering has been debating all this stuff since the 1990s, whether it's design patterns or different ways to do this stuff, different ways to put systems together. We don't actually have that level of maturity yet in the data world. If you look at like the amount of, you know, publications there are, and from, you know, there's no like Martin Fowler of data from like, you know, the mid 1990s.
But
So yeah, I think it's kind of like a different, it's a different thing. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I think something's changed since the mid-2000s. I think that what's changed since the mid-2000s, why this conversation's happening now, is business has gotten a lot more tech and analytics savvy.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. Yeah.
IT can focus on providing them the infrastructure, but then let them be empowered, and that's part of the data culture conversation we're probably going to have, so that business can drive their own outcomes. I think this is a big shift that I've seen over the last 5 to 7 years. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would disagree with, do the C-level execs care about this? They do, absolutely. Like we see in very large enterprises, take Capital One where I came from, the CEO of the company does a yearly strategy rollout, and from 2014 to 2019, he talked about data transformation and the importance of data, the importance of machine learning for reducing costs, and the primary concern there was the digital native companies, the digital banks. And so you look at large enterprises, and they absolutely need to get more technical, more quickly, use machine learning, reduce their cost infrastructure, and it ties back to that user experience, because what we saw in the existing architectures, especially for large companies, is those distributed systems fit for purpose, right? You had data warehouse in one platform, you had machine learning in another, you had Hadoop environments, you had on-prem systems. The user experience for people to have to context switch between the different tools in order to make sense of the data, and the data wrangling, you know, component of the data science process of just going to all these different systems, understanding the security model, how do you get access, all those things created a lot of friction.
Silos are hard.
Yeah, and so what you're really looking to achieve, I think, as you think through a new architecture is, there have been so many advances in the performance of network I/O, cloud storage, parallel reads from cloud storage, the chipsets that have improved and can run multiple instructions in parallel now. You can do more with the infrastructure more quickly. And so if you take a step back and look at it from the user perspective, how do I give the user access to more of the data and get more of those personas working together on the same platform versus these separate?
So are we saying that you should look to merge these silos into a common architecture? Are you saying that we should have the flexibility to support all the architectures? You know, which is it? Is it, you know, do we have a kind of break down the walls and move to a common approach, or do we try to find technology that can support all of it?
Well, I think,
or is it? But I mean,
there's a lot of architectural improvements that have happened over the last decade, right? You've got the storage compute disaggregation, you had the platform infrastructure disaggregation. So of course, you know, that's good architecture. It's always better to kind of have looser coupling or decoupling between these different things, because then you can pick and choose. But I think this debate's been going on, and frankly, I think it'll keep going on, which is best of breed versus a single stack. In the old days, we talk about it, you know, kind of up and down the stack. Now we're actually talking about it within the platform, right? You've got every wannabe mega platform vendor, really, and they have to, I'm not saying they shouldn't, they basically say, look, we can do stuff for BI, we can do SQL, we can do stuff for AI, we can do Spark, and we can do Python, or we can do stuff for streaming, we can et cetera, et cetera. So we can do structured, we can do unstructured. Of course, you have to do that, but ultimately, I think the customers have to decide: do I go with a single vendor solution, right, or do I pick and choose the graph database capabilities for one purpose?
But for example, one of the problems I found with multiple architectures is that certain things like data integration in particular has exploded in complexity. You've got data scientists writing R and Python to integrate data. You've got some other data scientists using data mining tools to drag and drop integrate data. Then you've got other people with BI tools doing self-service data prep, or there's standalone self-service data prep tools that they can go out and buy. And then you've got IT professionals using traditional ETL tools. And it's all going on. And as I said on the opening session this morning, one of my clients, the global CTO, said, the problem in this company is everybody's blindly integrating data with no attempt to share what they create. And the cost of integrating data is through the roof.
Yeah.
I mean, and it seems to be that we have all of these silos, and it seems to be one of the issues that's coming out of it. Is there not an easier way? Could we not build once, reuse everywhere, rather than have everybody? You know what I mean? I mean, are you not seeing this as an issue? I mean, you're in the data integration business, and to some extent, Confluent
I think
is,
some
right?
of this, actually, you mentioned best of breed. I think the cloud ecosystem actually allows best of breed. And being on the analyst side as well as on the implementation side, I'm sure many of you know, when you buy from a full stack vendor, you're not necessarily getting a single product. You're just getting a single vendor on the paycheck. Or on the invoice. So I think the cloud enables this, and even though, there's a cartoon that I shared on LinkedIn a couple weeks ago, like 5,000 of you actually liked this and reshared it, and it was, who wants clean data? Everyone raises their hand. Who wants to clean the data? Nobody raised their hand. But I do think the modern tools allow for more rapid, low-code data integration. When you talk about bringing in the third-party data, external data, cleaning that data actually gets harder. This is where I think, as Chris mentioned, some of the machine learning models, so augmented data prep is enabling better cleaning. But if we go back to, do we have common definitions? Yesterday I was with a customer and they said the number of definitions for turnover that we have, or even just revenue, it varies. Is it based on when the invoice was paid, or is it based on when the order was booked? Getting to common definitions has to be part of this.
Yeah, one of the things that we saw is just the definition of a monolith and how people think about the architecture. In the past, a monolith was a single system that tried to do perhaps more than it should. It became a single point of failure within your organization. The cloud changes that quite a bit because there's resiliency and scalability built in and things like that. Take like Amazon S3 storage, right? Built-in microservices to get and put data, it scales up, it distributes it, it's resilient, all these things. So the idea around the monolith is a little bit about, can you eliminate the single point of failure? Can you get more of your data workloads operating off of a common architecture? And I don't know that we're going to solve the debate between, do you have a Kappa architecture? Do you, it's
no, but I mean, for example, we're all being told about data fabric right now.
Sure.
Let's go out and do data
mesh,
fabric.
yeah.
Okay? Ditch all your tools and go data fabric.
Yeah.
Multi-cloud, hybrid, connects to everything. Isn't that saying consolidate and rationalize? I mean, if that's the cool thing to do, and we're saying, no, we have to be flexible and let best of breed happen.
I think the thing about architectures is you have to work out, all of these things are sort of nomenclature that wraps up a set of principles. I take the data mesh one as a good example, right? It's basically, it's four, but it's basically three that matter. It's like, make your data should be a product, like, should be treated as if it's a product, something that you absolutely take responsibility for. So if If you create data and give it to the world, you are responsible for it, and the buck stops with you. Making it self-service, that makes the organization quick, nimble, and then finally data governance, because you need some way for you to be able to, because it's all becoming decentralized, and that's the architectures that we tend to go for these days, you need some way to figure out where stuff is and make sure that it stays sane. Those are 3 principles, right? That's what a data mesh is. You don't have to use all 3 of them. You could use 1 or 2, or you could add a couple more of your own.
What do you mean I don't have to use all 3? You screw data governance?
Well, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, I'm saying data mesh is taking 3 things, which are 3 principles, which I think are valid in their in their own right, and saying, well, a good way to do this is to do these 3.
All right.
Maybe there's a 4th as well, which I'm not going to go into. But the point is that actually everyone has like a completely different. You're in a different domain. You have a different set of legacy systems. You have, a very different place that you're actually where you want to implement things. You want to implement your architecture. So you actually have to understand what the principles that sit underneath these things actually do, and then select the ones that work for you. Otherwise, you're just implementing some sort of pattern that somebody else is saying this works, and it tends not to work very well. Good examples of where this has gone wrong in the past, microservices, right? Microservices, I think, are now generally accepted to be being a good thing, but there was a lot of bad implementation on the route to where we are now, where people are actually, starting to do it pretty well. But that's because most of us now understand the underlying principles of microservices. Like, you don't actually want to share your database with somebody else because it's a nightmare, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me ask the audience, how many of you have got multiple ways or multiple tools in your organization that are being used to integrate data? Quite a lot of you. How many of you are able to reuse things across tools?
Well, let me ask a final question.
Nobody.
How many of you think one tool will solve it all? Nobody.
Nobody thinks one tool will solve it all.
How many wish one tool would solve?
But that's the thing.
Everyone wants
So that's
a
the
silver
thing.
bullet.
We wish for it,
We're all
but I
gonna
don't think we
work
can
there.
do it. I mean, I think.
Silver bullet.
I mean, the
wanna
reason
get
I
to
ask
that.
it,
I
the reason I ask it, well, let me ask one more question to the audience. How many of you spend 80% of your time integrating data rather than analyzing it?
Oh.
Well, that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Only one of you. Well, we made it, well, unless it's 90. I assume that's good. The reason I ask it, 3 years ago, Dr. Michael Stonebreaker, famous from Turing Award winner and MIT professor, a former Berkeley professor, was on this stage on this debate. And he said to the audience that data integration is now the biggest pole in the tent, as he put it, right? And he asked the audience how many of them are spending 80% of their time to integrate data, and almost every hand went up. And he said, this is an issue. Cost of it's too high. We've got to solve it. How many people think that the data integration problem within your organization is solved? Nobody.
It's all a
Okay.
question how you ask the question.
Does anyone think it's better than it was 10 years ago? Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so
That's good.
Making
Yes.
progress.
all right,
Yeah.
so
I think that's
maybe
important,
the
man. I think
answer here
people
is the
forget
jury's
how
jury's
truly
out,
terrible-
but it's a.
I want to maybe try an analogy around the principles here because I think again there's principles around the platform, and then there's principles around data integration. Since you're talking about data integration, because so I think we have to make a choice whether we try to figure out an implementation that's top down or that's emergent, right? So life is emergent, right? It's like you have some set of rules, and that causes some sort of an equilibrium, a macro equilibrium. But that allows us to then understand it and change the rules, and that creates a new equilibrium. That's the way I think we move. So the analogy for me is like, I don't know, music. So when you talk about tools, I talk about musical instruments. We can all learn to play a musical instrument, get together right now, and we'll sound like crap, right? The answer in the old days used to be that the church would say, this is how you do it. This is exactly how you play the instrument. And the composers would create these orchestras orchestral music, and of course it did work, but human beings ultimately didn't want that. They wanted jazz, they wanted rock and roll, they wanted lighter structure and more innovation. I think that's what we want with our data. So we need to, I think, keep that in mind and say
Right.
we keep changing.
So
as
we
learn
don't
more.
want to put a straitjacket on folks, we want to let it flourish.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have legal obligations which are getting progressively worse. You know,
So,
I
yeah.
thought Europe was bad enough with GDPR until I learned that the US was going to have 50 GDPR. I mean,
right.
that's insane. You know, so I mean, if we're doing
And each
business
of them is more important
in
than
all of
GDPR.
these states, you know, I mean, the legal obligations on companies is now getting progressively worse. And so, you know, we got different forces at work here. All right, let's turn my attention to kind of real time. I mean, clearly also, real time opens up a whole bunch of new challenges. And, you know, there's weird things that happen. Let's say it didn't happen in traditional world of data warehousing. For example, schemas change without notice. Without notice. I mean, there's, you know, and then there's the whole performance of all of that. And then there's the integration of streaming with things like historical data and data warehousing. And then there's the vast amount of data that could come in off of streaming data. And, you know, you don't necessarily have to store it all, but, you know, there's still companies with enormous challenges to hold that kind of data. So, you know, how do you suggest that companies deal with a real-time problem?
I think you probably have to write a book to answer that question, Mike. It had about 8 different points, and each of which is highly nuanced and complex.
Okay.
Yeah, I have no intention of trying to answer it.
All right.
Someone else can have that one.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was fortunate enough to do a keynote at a Kafka Summit a few years back for the work that we did at Capital One around streaming. And a couple of things that I think about is I tend to think about use cases and the service level agreement associated with them. And we bin them in a very strict initial pass to say, is this a sub-second response time use case, a multi-second, or a multi-minute? And when you take that lens for the type of workload that needs to be performed, it has cost implications, because if every use case needs to execute in less than a second, you've got a very different topology in your architecture than you do if you've got ones that fall in the multi-second and multi-minute. And in terms of data changes, one of the things that we did, and it's actually in the keynote if you're bored and can't sleep, you can watch it. We use Kafka very effectively to create a workflow where people could create streams similar to the way that you might register for a DNS. You could propose a stream name, it would validate it, and it would get approved. And we allowed, we separate this producer-consumer policies from the implementation details. And I think that's important when you think about data mesh. We would allow stream producers to actually have multiple streams in production for the same stream, right? That have a V1 and a V2, right? So there's this period of time where as you evolve the stream definition and that schema changes, if it's not a breaking change, then your consumer doesn't need to change at all. But if it is a breaking change, you need to be agile enough to let them define a new version of the stream, and as the consumers can update their consumption approach, they can take in the new information that was causing a breaking change.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
But obviously we can handle schema drift now, right? In tools like yours, for example, right? We can handle schema drift in order to be able to deal with that kind of problem.
Meaning that it breaks
Yeah.
if somebody's changed it in the source system or in the data platform. And this is where the integration between the analytics tools and the back-end systems, the notification of these changes is what you have to
But I think
adapt for.
it's much worse than that, especially as we move into these broker-based architectures. Basically, every publisher, every publish-subscribe point is a point of breakage potentially, because
Yes.
when you talk about schema, that could be semantics, that could be the location, the infrastructure that's used to produce the data. So all of these need to keep being dealt with. So when I think the concept of real time has really become what Chris was saying. It's just, hey, it's a mode and it's really about cost optimization and business need. But continuous is really the answer, right? Whether we want it sub-second or sub-hour, can that be continuous to the business? That's a challenge.
Okay, let's move away from architecture. I think we've had enough of that on the panel. I wanted to talk about a big issue at the moment, and the issue is that a lot of projects have failed. We've seen pretty high failure rates, and several analyst firms, giving statistics around all of that. And one of the big reasons given, in fact, I even put up a survey this morning on my opening session, which is still, for the last 4 straight years, over 90% of the audience said that culture is still a real issue. And Peter Drucker once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So, do you think that, here we are being told about data mesh. Data mesh is saying, domain does it all, right? But in the domain, you've got people who are focused maybe on one system, ERP system, right? So they are specialists in one system, whereas a data engineer has to pull data from multiple systems and has to know about data in multiple systems. And now we're talking about pushing responsibility for data products in a data mesh architecture. Do you think that's going to change the culture? Is that
I'd like that too.
Is that a good thing or about, what do you see here?
I think it's very similar to the innovator's dilemma. So companies have done something a certain way. It's very hard to drive innovation from within. I think data culture kind of falls into that same vein, right? You really need top-down sponsorship of that change, and then appoint something like a CDO that can help bridge the gap between business and IT. It's very easy to get enamored with the beauty of new architecture, but if it doesn't serve the purpose of the business, it's going to be meaningless. So I think culture has to be driven from the top down, and the role has to be senior enough and empowered enough to drive that culture. And that culture first starts with education. I think literacy, we've recently done a CDO survey where we found literacy was still a big issue. This is especially the case with AI ML. I think business doesn't really understand how AI ML work, and AI ML data scientists don't really understand how the business works. So because they're really focused on the math. So bridging that the gap, I think driving that cultural conversation is first all about literacy and then about empowerment. I think about having a top-down AGs to support that is critical.
I do think top-down is one way, but it also can be grassroots. So one of the surveys that we do identified that you mentioned 90% this morning said culture is the reason they failed. We did a global survey, 67% say culture is the #1 reason they have not been able to execute on their data and analytics strategy. You used the word failure, and even that, I don't think many have failed, or we view failure in the wrong way. If you have done experimentation and you've learned something from that, to me, that's a success. And yet, these big failures, again, if it's been a year-long experimentation, that's a problem. The other thing we have going on when we say we want to democratize data, some people don't want to democratize data because we have poor data literacy, poor data fluency, so they don't understand it and they don't trust it. But when data is used to punish, or it's been made to use to lie, so I think you used the term Dieselgate for talking about Volkswagen here and Wells Fargo. We've had this even with COVID, manipulating the numbers to present vanity metrics. All of this leads to a lack of culture and a lack of trust.
So we got to fix the trust problem in order to...
You do.
Yeah.
It is about trust, and how do you raise trust?
Yeah.
People have to understand the data, and it's the people change management, then they trust it. If you use data, if you expose bad data and say, you're not performing well, your cross-selling is not working well, and you say, what can we learn about that? Then there's a greater degree of trust. When data is used to punish, then people will manipulate it, and that's where some of the fear and resistance.
So you think governance is a big factor in breeding confidence in the data in order to change the culture?
Whose numbers do you trust? But the right amount of governance.
Okay. All right, let's switch the attention then to putting BI and analytics to work. I mean, there's been a lot of the last decade has all been about development, with huge frenzy of new technologies in the last decade. In data science, it's almost like being weekly. I mean, libraries coming out, all kinds of advances in technology, taking us through AutoML, data science workbenches. It's just like one thing after another, after another, after another. And there's so many technologies out there in a lot of organizations. You might say, well, it's best of breed, but it's back to the issue, it's very fractured. And I think a lot of executives are kind of frustrated with that because they're not getting enough of it out into production to make it really generate value for the business. Get the deployment thing. So, all I keep hearing from CIOs and CDOs and CEOs is they want it. Not only do they want quick wins, which you mentioned earlier, but they want to accelerate it. But if you're going to accelerate something, you can't have it all fractured. You've got to do something in order to tidy it up to be able to accelerate it, right? And so I guess what I'm asking is, what do you think companies should do to speed up, deployment and governance of all of this stuff? How do you see that? Because obviously, if we're trying to get more into deployment and use, to see real value from it, you don't become data-driven because we're in development all the time. It's deployment that's going to help you become data-driven in a sense, right?
Exactly. But Mike, I think it's more than data-driven. I mean, it's this term XOps is kind of the latest nomenclature moniker to try to address this. And again, we can always be cynics about yet another new term. But if you kind of look at that and say, what's the principles, what's the philosophy of it? It's about generalizing the operationalization of all the technology functions, not just data, right? Because there's so many things, like security. Is security part of data, or is it adjacent data? Privacy, of course, BI, model, ML, you name it, right? So all these things. I think each of these issues has its own life cycle. ML might have some sort of explore, experiment, evaluate type of life cycle where you learn and you deploy. Data might have a different life cycle, right? So we all have these life cycles. We've got to kind of speed all of those up, but they all have kind of integration points or kind of coupling needed to solve the whole problem. So I think we've got to remember that and realize that everybody's got domain. I'm not talking about our vendors. It's even specialization in the business. Everybody's got a domain, but you actually own nothing. You have to share as much as you can and expose as much as you can in order for the business to really succeed.
But what about it seems to be that if different parts of the business are producing all of this stuff, whether it's BI reports, whether it's machine learning.
I hope they're not still doing reports, legacy reports. There's too many new questions.
So is report a bad word? Okay.
Well, we say dashboards are dead, so
okay, so reports are anciently dead then in that case.
Well, yeah.
Okay, all right.
So I mean, just to pick up on that thread, I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think with BI, deploying BI, we're seeing performance is still a problem, right? Whatever shape that takes, whether that's still reports for someone or search for others, I think performance continues to be the biggest impediment to getting more users and more data in the hands of those users. So I think accelerating BI has to do with accelerating the underlying engine that powers that BI. I think ML right now is a separate silo. In a lot of cases, it's a separate silo, and it has its own workflow that's orchestrated separately. You extract the data, you run that through the models that have been trained, maybe you're monitoring the drift on those models, and then you're loading that data back in and helping the dashboard developers understand what that means, how to factor that into the existing BI infrastructure, and then deploying that. I think there's too much of a separation there that should be bridged. We really think that a trained ML model can be deployed directly on the data, and with a high-performing underlying engine plug for us, you can bring those together.
What do you mean? Do you not see that there's a need for something like I mean, we talked about data catalogs, which are everywhere these days. But what about some kind of analytics catalog to even know what's out there,
Sure.
so that people can see what's out? I mean,
Yeah,
is that not
I
an
guess
issue?
we take a bit of a holistic view against this at Databricks, right? In our minds, the data warehouse and the BI reporting, and it still exists in a lot of organizations because people interpret the reports and make business decisions against them. And as you're building out a new data environment and trying to deploy more machine learning models and get the machines to do that, the integrity of the data, the bias that may or may not be present in the data, GDPR, CCPA, all of the compliance and regulatory things that you have to worry about become really important. And so when I think about pushing things out from a data mesh perspective to the owner, the source systems at Capital One, we had 1,000 production applications. And there was no way we were going to go through and re-platform each of those 1,000 systems to handle all the principles that were articulated with data mesh. What we saw was the need to be able to create data products, to have the producer be responsible for the quality of the data and the rules that in the schema that needed to be adhered to, but we needed a platform that would enable them to give them a framework to actually do the implementation around that. And we didn't think doing it in each of the source systems was the most cost-effective way because the platforms couldn't scale to support it, not all of them could. Most of the platforms were in operation and maintenance mode, so they didn't have the development teams to add these features to it. So the data lake became the common ground. And so getting back to that monolith and distributed all the things that we said about why we think that's a good thing in the ecosystem and why we think it still supports the data mesh principles. But the governance piece is critical because you don't want to be deploying models in a silo. You don't want to be training your models off of siloed data. We would see single node data science where people would take extracts out of Teradata, do Jupyter notebooks on their laptop. They'd build a model, they'd deploy it, and then when it got into the real world and used all the data, the models didn't perform well. So if you can create an environment or a data platform that allows you to look at all the data and start getting the data science community going at the data in its earliest, rawest format from those source systems, I think you're going to be better off. And if you curate it then to get to a point where you can run those reports that in many organizations are still required because they're still making human-based business decisions against those reports.
Right.
Yeah, and so Chris keeps using the word reports, and I want to clarify, regulatory reports, sorry, many of you have to live with them, but the process to create them, if we are having to go through an expert, I'm more interested in the insight because you have so many new questions. Right. I understand in the UK we're panicking about CO2 right now. Are we going to have shortages of beer in the next few days? Where will I get a new CO2 supply? These are critical decisions. So many new questions. And if I use old technologies and old processes, if I say I have to throw my requirements over the fence, wait a few days, a few weeks for an expert to come back and say, here's where you can newly source your CO2, they're already sold out. We're on to a new problem. So some reports remain, but I'd rather we get to a faster way to get to the insights.
So on a similar vein, with the terminology, the thing that makes me squeamish every time, like reports does to you, is governance. Governance, we've been saying governance for 20 years. How many of you really want governance? I'm curious.
We want the benefits of it.
You want the benefits of it.
Be brave. How many of you want governance?
Exactly. The idea of calling
Everybody wants freedom, right?
calling it governance. You want to work around it. That's what I find in our customers. They say that's where you slow down. We need to go fast. We want to have the confidence. We need to go fast. And I think this new term, data observability, that a lot of people are starting to talk about, is I think the right idea because that gives.
Let's pick up on that because one of the things I did want to ask is, with all of this data science out there and all these models out there, it seems to be looking a little bit further down the line here, that we are on the cusp of the beginning of a new wave, which is kind of the area that I tried to talk about this morning in my keynote, which is AI-driven automation.
Yeah.
And to really accelerate the speed of business on the back of not only automating the decisions, but automatically learning from it and observing that and trying to get better at it. I mean, do you see that this whole area of AI-driven automation is coming? It's a big wave that people should look at?
It's absolutely, and I don't think it's just coming. Some of our early adopters were on automated insights and now insight to action, but this doesn't do away with the human intelligence. You have to be able to say, wait, does this pass the smell test? Algorithms automated without the human insight, that's dangerous. We can look at some of the models, the price gouging, the unintentional price gouging early in the pandemic where a bottle of sanitizer cost, over $1,000. It's for the human to say, okay, that was not good. I think it's already started.
Right.
I mean, that relates to the point that Chris was bringing up around biases in machine learning, right? So understanding those biases, because letting machines have at it without that human oversight, I think is problematic.
I think I was just going to add, I don't know if the mics are still on.
Okay.
Yes, they're still
I
on.
think
Google published a white paper that says, titled effectively, I think, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Data, which said a large amount of good quality data with a less sophisticated model will outperform a more sophisticated model with less data, and especially less quality data. So the message that we talk to when we're talking to executives about how do they enable their workforce, the cultural component, is don't worry so much about getting PhD level machine learning experts. Worry about the governance and the quality of the data, and then work on simple models that you can execute. But the key thing around whether or not the machine is doing it or if it's machine and human assisted is the observability and the reproducibility, right? You need to know how that model is performing. You need to know if there's any implicit bias in it. You need to understand what data was used to train the model so that under an audit from the federal regulators like we had at Capital One, you'd be able to go back and say, this was the data that was used to train the model, and oh yes, we've discovered some bias. We're going to remediate that, and then, oh, by the way, we'll go back and we'll communicate this to all the customers whose financial decisioning engine decisions went again, if there was a slew of customers, a cohort, we would go back and we would inform them, we'd rerun the process with a better trained model. So there, you can remediate it, but you need to be able to reproduce it.
Right. Okay. We're nearly at the end, so let me just start to wrap the whole thing up. I mean, let me ask you guys, you're the technologists, right? I mean, so what really difficult problems do you kind of see unfolding, and, where is this going? I mean, obviously you've all got R&D departments. I mean, do you see anything that you're building that's going to help tackle some of these really difficult problems? Anything that you can share?
I don't think my mic's, oh, there we go. The one we're working on is the data culture problem. So with analytics savvy growing in the business, letting business be the driver of creating their own data warehouses by creating an abstraction layer and empowering the business user to be able to drive that. So we're working on an automation layer to drive, ease the development of data warehouses very quickly.
Okay.
So you use the word technologist. I actually say I'm a business person that just looks for great technology to solve problems. And working on the vendor side just in the last 2.5 years, one thing that I'm really excited about, I don't know if at our booth we can show this, and I'm thinking, will I get in trouble sharing this? But Monitor, ThoughtSpot Monitor, it actually will alert you when there's been a change in behavior proactively on your KPI. So this isn't your static thresholding when you just say, did sales dip below 10%? It's a change in behavior and alerting you, business people, on a mobile device. It's one of the things I'm most excited about.
Okay.
But if you say, what am I worried about? Some of the bias at scale as we automate these things, I think this is something we all have to pay attention to.
Okay. Sorry, Girish.
So on our side, I guess, just finish off that observability idea. So, we're in the pipeline business, so by definition, we try to deal with multiple platforms and help with that. I think for too long it's been opaque. We built this kind of instrumented pipelines, and we call that smart. Instrumentation isn't smart. Instrumentation is like the activator for smarts. So we're looking at bringing AI to the metrics in the pipeline. And just like we talk about, do we figure things out at the source? Do we get the models at the source? Do we look at the lake? Well, what about the space in between? Not to say that's the only place to look, but we want to bring focus there so we can kind of optimize the whole.
Please, Chris, go ahead.
Well, we've got two things that I think the audience should be aware of. The first is we have a new architecture called a lakehouse architecture, and the name suggests it takes kind of the best pieces of an enterprise data warehouse and the best components of a data lake, so the flexibility of data set types and the ability to run different workloads to include machine learning, but also the SQL-based workloads that you see traditionally done in enterprise data warehouses. So the lakehouse architecture is kind of the big bet that Databricks is making moving forward.
Okay. Any final advice for our audience over the next 12 months?
I was going to say next 12 minutes. Everyone has beers at
Beer.
the booth.
Beer. We're
It's
gonna
not about the
cut. Okay.
technology,
All right.
it's about the business value.
Looks like beer is taking priority.
And America's reopen soon. Come visit us
Yeah.
on that side of the pond.
All right.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks
Yeah, thank
to
you.
all of our panelists again this year, and thank you for coming to it, and enjoy the rest of the show. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.